couple of minutes, Nathan, just let us know. I think we all know anyway that the entrance is from the back side, so I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping, then I'll hand over to Geet. So if anyone's coming in, they can come from the back. If you're leaving at the end of the talk, we're leaving from the front. You already know when you got in, you got your temperature checked, so that's just because Manjula is sitting here. We all know about where our fire exit is. There is no fire alarm expected today, but it's just in front of treatment center. If you go out, if you're not on call, then please put your telephones on either silent or vibrator, whichever you prefer. And if you need to go to answer your bleeps or your phone calls for any clinical reason, then please leave from the back doors to minimize any disturbance. So I'll hand over to Geet to formally open the session.
Good afternoon and welcome everybody to Respect and Civility in the Workplace. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Geet Silver, one of the junior doctors in Kettering and also current MES president. It doesn't seem too long ago where I met Ravi and we talked about our passion of creating a caring culture in the workforce. We therefore started Respect Empowers to ensure that no matter who you are or what role you play, you will be supported by your peers, your friends and your colleagues. From there, it really took off quite quickly. We saw not only our small group grow in both number and diversity, but we also saw senior support from the executive committee, which I'm very thankful about. Since then, over the past few months, we've seen numerous acts of kindness. We've seen the We Care team deliver meals outside working hours to junior doctors and other healthcare professionals. We've seen the We Care Cafe launched outside for a place to eat and relax, and also the open office to verbally unload when we're feeling stressed. I can only thank the team around me, the IT team, everyone at Respect Empowers to bring together what's sure to be a thought-provoking evening. Throughout the talk, there'll be opportunities to ask questions. Those who are in the audience, you can raise your hands and we'll try and come to you. But if you're online, just type your questions out and I'll try and vocalize them as well. Due to the essence of time, we don't have all the time in the world. So we're going to sit down afterwards and email you the responses of any unanswered questions as well. Now, over the past few months, we've certainly been through some challenging situations, and the necessity of respect, civility, and taking care of one another has never been more important. Therefore, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Chris Turner, who's an emergency medicine consultant, a TED Talk speaker, and also the head of nationally renowned Civility Saves Lives. Thank you.
Hi, it is lovely to be here. Normally just jump straight into telling a story, but I just want to say how good it is to be here today, how good it is to be in a room with colleagues, to actually see people and not be staring at a little green light on my computer wondering what on earth is happening on the other side, or people just walking away. Is there nobody there? It's lovely to have a captive audience, so thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. And thanks, Keith, and thanks, Ravi. It should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning, but what happened was that when the consultant surgeon turned up for her list, she discovered that the 2-patient list had become a 3-patient list. She was understandably upset about that because she was prepared and the team were prepared for this 2-patient list, and she found the person that was responsible and remonstrated with them, and they had a heated and slightly unpleasant conversation. At the end of it, however, it was decided to do the operation, and the reason for that was that the 3rd patient on the list had already been brought into hospital. They were downstairs. They were waiting to go for an operation, and to turn around and to tell them that we weren't going to do it just felt like completely the wrong thing. So the patient first and decided to go on with the operation. By the time theatre started, the room was tense because everybody was aware of this stuff going on. When 5 minutes into the first operation, the scrub practitioner passed the wrong instruments, the consultant said, "Oh, come on, just give me what we need." When 10 minutes later, the same thing happened again, The response was, "For God's sake, I thought that you knew how to do this. Just pass me what I need." Head back into the belly of the patient. The surgeon kept working, but it was clear that the scrub practitioner was distressed. And the circulating sister was called, and the circulating sister looked, thought this is a distressed member of staff, and took the scrub practitioner out and replaced the scrub practitioner with a different person. Apparently without the consultant noticing, but that's not that unusual if you're focusing that hard on something. The rest of the operation was unremarkable. The next operation was unremarkable as well. The third operation, at the third operation, the initial scrub practitioner felt able to come back in. The circulating sister discussed this, and they came back in and joined the operation. The operation itself was relatively fine, a little bit more blood loss than expected, and it finished, and they did the counts, everybody signed out of theatre, the patient went to recovery, and everything seemed fine. The first two patients had unremarkable post-operative recoveries. They did just fine. Third patient had a different journey. Came back to the emergency department once, then a second time, and was seen by the surgeons on each occasion as is normal practice. When they came back a third time, they reported having had some sweats and some temperatures. And it was decided that despite the fact that their obs were normal, we should probably do a CT of their abdomen. And that's what we did. And when we did the CT of our abdomen, we found that there may be a retained foreign product, an object. The patient went to theatre, did a laparotomy, and we removed a large gauze swab which had been left in there inadvertently in their operation. There was, of course, a datix. There was, of course, an investigation. It was an SI. And what happened was that we found that the scrub practitioner needed to go for retraining. The scrub practitioner effectively needed to be taught how to count, and that the scrub practitioner wasn't to be allowed to practice until we had proven that they could do those things. And I think we missed the point. I think we missed the chance to be better. And I think that in the same circumstances, exactly the same thing might happen again. Healthcare is a team business, and we deliver it in complicated, sometimes complex environments. We do it with varying outcomes. And for the last 10 years, as well as being an emergency medicine consultant, I've been a governance lead. So I've been investigating and trying to understand situations like that one, and I've done it across 3 different organisations. And if 10 years ago you'd come to me and you said, "Chris, what do you think the answer is?" I would have been categorical with you. I would have said the answer is process. If only everybody did what they're meant to do. But there's a problem with that. And the problem is this. If you start to investigate these issues, you find that the people that you're investigating are good, diligent, knowledgeable professionals, the sorts of people you would want to look after yourself or your family. And yet here they are at the end of this chain of events, and somehow we find them as the root cause. And I slowly, and perhaps not as quickly as many other people would have come to this conclusion, I slowly realised that I must be missing something. And what I think I was missing is this, that the way that we describe stuff is written down on paper. That's work as imagined. But practice, how we really do our jobs on a day-to-day basis, practice happens between us and in environments, and I simply didn't respect the complexity of that. But once you start to look into it, there's a heap of evidence around it. And so now, if somebody was to ask me what I think the issue is when something goes wrong, I still think process is important. It's really important to be able to describe what it is that we think should happen. But something else is more important, and that's people, how we treat each other. And I think the evidence will bear me out. But for clarity, I don't think I'd have been invited here today if I just wanted to come stand in front of you and talk about the avoidance of error. There isn't one of us in this room who comes to work in the morning to avoid error. If we want to avoid error, there's a way of doing that, and that's by not coming to work. You know, if it's all about avoiding the bad stuff, we just stay at home. We come to work for a different reason. We come to work because we aspire to giving excellent care, the very best care that we can within the resource constraints, and we all know that they're there. We come to work to do that, and this is what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about the environments that allow us to be the best versions of ourselves and to provide the best possible care. What I'd like to do now for a few minutes is talk about complexity, because I've already said that we deliver healthcare in complicated and sometimes complex environments, and that's easy to say. But what do we really mean when we're talking about complicated and complex? And I'm going to do something now which you apparently should never do in talks, which is to build a graph. And it's not just any old graph, it's an ugly graph, so I apologise in advance. However, it's not my graph, by a guy called David Rook from Hartshill Consulting. It's a variation of something called the Stacey diagram. That doesn't really matter. But this guy has one of Harvard Business Review's top 10 downloaded papers ever. So he's a deep thinker about leadership and about complexity. And when I saw this graph, it gradually but profoundly changed how I think about how we deliver healthcare, and particularly about my leadership role. The first bit of it is his graph, and then after that, I'll show you what we've built on it over the last few years. So I told you it was ugly, and it is, and I'm sorry in advance. Do we agree what the problem is? Do we agree what the solution is? Now we can make that, that's already a wee bit complex. We can make that a bit uglier by putting the high points at the intersection, so let's do that. And already you're sitting there going, trying to get your head around it. Don't worry, it explains itself very quickly. If we start with simple puzzles, 2 plus 2, we all agree what the problem is, and we all know what the answer is. Move on to hard puzzles. Sudoku. I don't know how to do Sudoku. Somebody would need to teach me. And I know that once you start to do it, there are easy ones and there are fiendishly difficult ones. Then it's complicated. And the examples often given of complicated is a liver transplant. You might have the skills to do absolutely everything required for a liver transplant. You might think you do, you probably don't, but you might think you've got the skills to do everything required for a liver transplant. But you could not do it on your own, because you need a team of people working simultaneously to do everything that's required and get to the far end. And how I see one problem might not be how somebody else who would see that problem. My solution might not be their solution, particularly if they happen to be an expert at it. And then there's complex. The classic example of complex that's talked about is Syria. Lots of different people think lots of different things are the problems in Syria, and they have lots of different solutions, many of which are diametrically opposed to each other. Within healthcare, the example that's most often used is the 4-hour target, but it could literally be any target, because you can hit targets, but you never hit a target without affecting the performance of other bits of an organization. And complex stuff is so much deeper. Now, I just want to touch on something. What do we test? How do we as individuals get to be in this room today? We got to be in this room today largely because when we were kids and young adults, we went to school, went to uni, and we learned to dominate pieces of paper. We learned to dominate pieces of paper in exam halls, pieces of paper that had the answer. There was a right answer, there were wrong answers, and that's what we learned to do. And if you're a doctor, if you're in my position, that continues up until your late 30s frequently for lots of people, where you sit your membership exams, your fellowship exams, and there are right answers and there are wrong answers. And that is all about personal mastery. That's all about us as individuals knowing the answers to everything that is chucked in our direction. But I would put it to you that perhaps in healthcare, we get credibility from that personal mastery, but perhaps we get our results in the team mastery bit, the bit where we work with others to head towards getting the best possible outcomes. And I'd suggest maybe the skill set required for personal mastery and the skill set required for team mastery are not the same thing. In fact, I'd go as far as to say they can be wildly different. We all know people who are brilliant at answering lots and lots and lots of questions and knowing the answers to stuff, but who don't work necessarily so well in teams. And at the beginning, you'll have seen that I said, complexity in the lemon I was sold. Well, the lemon I was sold is a lemon that many of you will have been sold. And it's this. This is the medical version, but there are many other versions. Whatever it is that you do, there will be a version within your job. It says, when you go to uni, you're going to learn stuff. You're going to get clever and clever and clever. And in my world, once I became a house officer, I would know more than the medical students, and I did. And when I became an SHO, I would know more than house officers, probably did. When I was a registrar, more than the SHOs. And by the time I was a consultant, I would know more than anybody else in the room about pretty much anything, anytime they wanted to ask me something. And that sounds crazy. Yeah, that sounds completely crazy. And yet, I lead for quality improvement in my department. My higher specialist trainees, guys about to become consultants, frequently believe that they should have all the answers to all the questions that people come to them with. And when we're doing quality improvement, that's a catastrophe. There was a time when this kind of was the truth, and that's maybe in the 30s, 40s, when there was less to know in medicine, although there's still a lot. Most of what we thought we knew then, we now know is wrong anyway. And when nurses didn't go to university and all the rest of it. But the teams that we work in now are completely different. So there's a couple of things that happen as we go up this graph, and this is us getting to the stuff that we've added to this. The first is that it's fairly self-evident that as the situation moves up into complicated and complex, you need teamwork. You can't do it on your own anymore. The second bit is a little bit more involved. So this is Shuli. I'm married to Shuli. She is an emergency medicine consultant as well, fortunately in a different hospital to the one that I work in. She's smarter than me. I think she would agree with that. She's Welsh, she's Bangladeshi, she's Muslim. I could live for 100 years. I will never see the world through Shuli's eyes. I won't even see bits of medicine through her eyes. And we used to say to people that if you want to understand something from somebody else's perspective, you have to think about, imagine yourself in their shoes. And that sounds like a great idea, except for it turns out it doesn't work. There's a couple of studies in the last 3 years about this. Turns out that it doesn't work, and this is why. So here I am, Chris, looking at a problem. Squat, middle-aged Scottish man, no longer with a beard. And I'm looking at this problem, and I see it like this. And I think, yeah, but how would Shuli think about this problem? So what I do is I swing my lens around. And I look at the problem from here. And I go, so that's how Shuli sees the problem. But I swing the lens around, I look at the problem with absolutely all of my unconscious biases still in play. Because they're unconscious, I simply can't see it from her perspective. And if we want to see problems from other people's perspectives, there are two things that we have to do, and there is no shortcut to this, unfortunately. The first one is to ask them what they think, and the second one is to listen to what they say. And we all want a shortcut there, but the evidence says there isn't one. So we need teamwork. But as we ask people and listen to their answers for these complicated and complex problems, for which there are many different perspectives, something else happens. When we walk in the room, we think we've got the answer, we think we know what the issue is, then you start listening to other people. We start listening, we start hearing more and more and more, and we need to be prepared to do something that we never got rewarded for in exams. We need to be prepared to compromise. We need to be prepared to change our minds. That thing that we thought was the right answer, that we felt, we need to be able to step back and go, actually, now I know more. That doesn't look like the right answer. The right answer looks like something a bit different. And that's really difficult for many of us. And if a little bit of this sounds like a veiled plea for equality and diversity, I should probably unveil it. It's an absolute plea for equality and diversity. If we want to understand the services that we provide, if we want to understand complex problems, we need to listen to everybody who's involved, and we need to get as many different perspectives as possible. And of course, that includes patients and relatives as well when we're working in healthcare. So what do people do to make complex things understandable? Simplify them. And that would be lovely if that worked. But guess what? Simplifying complex problems often doesn't work. And I'll give you an example of this. All of us look at other people's jobs and think we kind of understand them. We look at them and think, it doesn't look that hard. Being the chief exec, come on. You know, easy stuff. You could do it. You look at one thing, another thing. We all think that we can do it, but because what we're doing is we tend to simplify them down in our head. And I had an example of this a number of years ago, and was working in UHCW, and I think it'd be fair to say that we had fallen out of favour as an emergency department with the executive team. I really like the executives that I work with. Okay, so I'm not about. I think they do a really difficult job. So I'm not here to slag off the executives. I think they would agree that we had fallen out of favour with them, and we needed a new clinical director. And we thought somebody from within us would be the clinical director. And then we heard that there wasn't going to be somebody from within us, and we thought, okay, an external clinical director, we're a bit uncomfortable with that, but okay. And then we heard that it was possible that the external clinical director wasn't going to be a doctor, and the doctors amongst you will know how uncomfortable that was as a thought. But there are departments that are run very well by people who are not doctors as clinical directors. And then we heard that they were somebody from outside the organisation, and that they weren't a doctor or a nurse. In fact, they'd last worked clinically many years previously, and we thought, nah, of course not. Nobody's going to do that. And then what happened? Of course, we got our new clinical director, who hadn't worked clinically in 15 years, who was brought in, and I can only imagine what the interview was like. I have no idea, so I'm just completely making this up for your benefit, but my own as well. I can imagine that he went into the interview and he said, yes, I will get operational grip. Operational grip is one of these things that we quite like to bandy around sometimes. I'll get operational grip, and I'll be innovative. And then I think he probably sealed the deal by saying, I'll be disruptive. And at that, it was like, hallelujah, we found our man, executive thigh rubbing and much happiness. So he got, I'm glad you laughed at that. So he got the job. And here's a couple of tips for anybody who's ever going into a new job. If you go to your new job and you go for your 3 days of induction, it's probably worthwhile going to the department and saying hello to the people with whom you're going to be working. Probably, they're probably anxious to meet you. And the second bit that goes on top of that is, it's probably not a great idea to immediately go on holiday for 2 weeks after your 3 days of induction, because that creates something of an information and expectation vacuum. And then he arrived, and again, really nice guy, really nice guy. He turns up, and we had a meeting, and he came into our office to meet us. Knocked on the door, walked in, and we have a Wednesday morning meeting with all the consultants, so there's about 18 of us, and there's usually about 12 to 15 are there. Pre-COVID, we would sit in a circle. It's a bit like circle work. Hello, my name's Chris, I'm an emergency medicine consultant. We had 73 breaches on my last shift, and everybody looks at you and go, oh, that's really terrible, but well done, Chris, for coming in today. It's like AA for emergency medicine consultants. And he came in, and said, hello, folks, how are you? And he said, hi. And he sat down, and I remember the conversation well. He came in and he said, folks, I know you've all been waiting for me to arrive, but I've got to tell you, it's going to take me 3-4 weeks before I can sort this place out. And I don't know if those really uncomfortable conversations when you find yourself, you start off making eye contact and you find you don't know what happens in between, but eventually you're just looking at your feet. You're looking at your feet and you're feeling your toes, and your toes are curling in your shoes. And I was so aware of my toes curling in my shoes, and I thought, I wonder if everybody else is doing this. And then I did the thing I was never brave enough to do at church when I was a little kid. So I looked up to see what everyone was doing. And I looked up, and the entire room is people staring at their own feet. And he finished talking, and he got up and he left. And pretty much as he left, the discussion about how long he was going to last had already started. And not in a bad way. We did not wish this man malice. Absolutely did not. And we did everything we could to try to support him. However, he didn't stay for very long. No, enough said. And what he did was something that's actually measurable, and there's a whole bit of psychology on this, and it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect comes along when we look at something that other people are doing, and with very little understanding of their world, we assume we have got tremendous understanding of their world and that we could have impact upon it. And it is not just about it. It's about all of us looking at somebody else's job. We look at the chief executive's job and we think we could do that. We look at the porters. You look at the porter's job and you think, hey, I could do that. Tell you what, if you're an experienced porter in an organisation, you know so many things that nobody else knows. You know how to get things done that nobody else can get done. And there's a couple of things about this graph that I really like. The first thing is this is somebody else's stolen graph, but know nothing is spelled NO, and I just like that. And the second thing is that every so often in the literature, that first peak is referred to as Mount Stupid. And that's all of us looking at somebody else's job and thinking we fully understand it, particularly if they've been doing it for a long time, because they are experts by experience, even if you don't recognise them as being an expert otherwise. And what this boils down to is that when we're looking at complex situations, we aren't going to understand them on our own. We need to ask and we need to listen. And the more complex a situation gets, the better we do when we work together. But working together, of course, is all about us working in teams. So what's the evidence around working in teams? And you can look at this through lots of different lenses. One way of looking at this is just to look at the sort of physiology of us as individuals. And we know that drinking, we know that eating, and we know that sleep are really important. And one thing we know, and this is, I remind myself of this at this point at the top, one thing we know is that when people are dehydrated, their cognitive ability is impaired. And in fact, it becomes measurably impaired from 2% dehydration. We know that if people stay up all night, their decision-making profile changes. They take more risks. In fact, it's the equivalent of drinking 2 or 3 pints of beer. And pretty much everybody knows somebody who, when they've not eaten, is perhaps not the best version of themselves. Yeah. But that's just one way of looking at it. There's a whole bunch of other evidence about how well teams function together. And the daddy of this is Michael West within the NHS. You know, the NHS staff survey is one of the biggest staff surveys in the world. Michael West, professor from Lancaster, has been interpreting the NHS staff survey and correlating it with results for organisations and even down to individual departments for many years. And he can show the impact of different sizes of teams and how teams work together. And for example, 8 is about the optimum number or the maximum number of people to have in your team. Teams that have 2 away days a year do much better than teams that don't have away days per year. But one bit of his work that I'd really like to spend a couple of minutes on just now is about, are you in a real team or a pseudo team? Turns out that 98% of us in the NHS believe that we work in a team, which always begs the question to me, what are the 2% doing? You know, who are these people? Of course, you've never met them because they don't work in a team. And 98% of us work in a team, but only 40% of us work in a real team. And what's the difference between a real team and a pseudo team? Well, a real team can tell us what we're trying to achieve here today, this week, this month, this year. They know what our goals are. Pseudo teams can't. Real teams perform at a higher level than pseudo teams. And that seems a bit crazy. Hey, how could only 40% of us be working in real teams? It seems crazy till I'll give you an example from my world. So I work in a dirty great department. I mean, we see up to 700 patients a day, and there are, I think, 280 or more than that employees within the emergency department at UHCW, and I can genuinely say that I like every single one of them. And I know that I get a different version of people as a consultant than perhaps other people get that as well, but I like everyone and respect everyone. And I am measured by myself and by my colleagues by how well I can deliver good, hopefully excellent care in as safe a way as possible. And that's how I measure myself, that's how my colleagues measure me medically. But I work along, and how I measure them as well. I work alongside some people who are not being measured in the same way as I'm being measured. I work alongside some managers who are being hung, drawn, and quartered on their ability to deliver the 4-hour target. Now, about 15 years ago when this came along, 4-hour target and good patient care were really well aligned, really well aligned. What happened over austerity period of time around then is that 4-hour target and good patient care drifted apart a lot of the time, not all of the time, but a lot of the time. And now it is entirely possible for us to hit the target, but to miss the point of care. And that gap between these two competing directions manifests itself as hostility. It manifests itself as people feeling that other people don't understand them, and sometimes it manifests itself as anger. And within the NHS in England, we have, sadly, the best ever example of this happening, and that's mid-staffs. Now, I worked in mid-staffs. That was the first of my 3 organisations I've worked in. I worked in mid-staffs as a consultant, and in mid-staffs, we, the medical staff, believed that they, the non-clinical staff, were idiots in trying to stop things getting better. They, the non-clinical staff, believed that we, the medical staff, were idiots who were trying to not make things better. These guys were being measured on one thing at that time, and that was finance. And it's really easy to look at them and say these guys are bad guys because of what happened. and it would be so wrong and so simplistic. These were good, hard-working executives who were threatened with the loss of their jobs if they did not hit the financial targets. That's not just their job, that's their livelihood, that's their house, that's everything they are being threatened with. And it is no surprise that when the two didn't marry up, that resulted in tension across the middle. If in mid-staff, and I've thought about this a lot because it was a defining experience in my life, if in mid-staff we had managed to talk to each other, if we had just had the conversations, respectful conversation, understanding what we were trying to achieve, I'm uncomfortably certain that we could have avoided an awful lot of the bad stuff that happened in mid-staff and the pain and misery that families suffered as a consequence of it. And I think it was for want of talking and allowing ourselves to think of us and them, because us and them is always poison. And what Michael West's work shows is that if we could move the percentage of people in real teams in the NHS in England from 40% to 65%, we would save between 5,000 and 12,500 lives per year in the NHS in England. And we do it because when you align, you spend your energy going in the same direction rather than fighting about the direction that you're going in. If you've ever been in a team that's pulling in different directions, you just know that that's a really ineffective way to be working. But within medicine, we like a randomized controlled trial. And there really weren't any randomized controlled trials about the impact of performance of behaviour on teams until 2015, when Riskin and Ayres had the first of their landmark papers. And what they did is they got teams together who were matched for ability. Got those teams together, and then they put them through paediatric peri-arrest simulations, a whole bunch of them. And the lovely thing about putting people into simulations is you can measure time to diagnosis, accuracy of diagnosis, time to decision to do first life-saving procedure, ability to do first life-saving procedure in a high-stress situation. And what they did was they measured how well these teams who were matched, doctors and nurses, matched for their supposed ability on paper. And this is what they found. They found that outcomes vary. And they vary from the catastrophic to the truly excellent. And then they messed around with the variables, and they found that one variable was responsible for 40 to 60% of the variance of this graph. And that's rudeness or incivility. How we treat each other when we work in teams appears to have an incredible impact on the ability of that team to perform. I'd leave it there, but there's another study that I'd like to briefly mention. And this is a study by a guy called Dan Katz. And this is about individuals, and it's about anaesthetists and surgeons, but it's not about anaesthetists and surgeons. This is about any of us working with each other. And what Dan did was, Dan's an anesthesiologist in New York State. What he did was he got anaesthetists who were about to become consultant level, and he put them through a simulation. And in the simulation, there is a massive hemorrhage in an operation. The anaesthetist is the person who resuscitates the patient at that point, and the surgeon tries to stop the massive hemorrhage. And as the anaesthetist went in, they were put into one of two conditions. One where the surgeon was polite, and the other one where the surgeon was slightly rude. Slightly rude. So they open the door, come on, hurry up, you guys. The last guys were a bit faster than you. And they come in and they do the operation, and they'd be a little bit snarky to the anaesthetist, but nothing massive. And this is what they found. They found, what they did was, sorry, I should tell you this, but they videoed the performance of the anaesthetist. So they then got the videos watched by experts who didn't know if the surgeon had been rude or not, and they said, are these guys performing at the level you would expect for somebody about to be a consultant? When you have a polite surgeon, 91.2% of them were performing at that level, and that's kind of where you'd expect. When it was the slightly rude surgeon, 63.6% of people with these anaesthetists were able to perform at the expected level. And for those of you that like p-values, that's a p of 0.007. But that's not the most interesting thing about this for me. The most interesting thing about this study for me is afterwards they went and they asked the anaesthetist, did you have a rude surgeon? Did you have a polite surgeon? They got it right. They could tell. And then they asked another question. Did that have an impact on your performance? Of course not. I'm a professional. And we are just very poor at understanding the impact that other people's behaviour has on us. We think we are immune to it, and we're not. And what I think this boils down to is that the single most important factor determining how well teams perform at, if they're competent and they have the tools they need, appears to be how we treat each other. And in particular, rudeness and incivility. So incivility, if it's such a big deal, how come I went to Edinburgh Medical School in the 1980s and nobody ever mentioned it to me? In fact, Edinburgh Medical School in the 1980s was like a dirty, great Victorian incivility factory. We manufactured rudeness on industrial scales, and then we exported it to you, the English. I did my membership exam, and I did membership in surgery and then emergency medicine, and nobody mentioned it. Did my fellowship exam in emergency medicine. Not once did anybody mention the impact of behaviour on performance. And there's a reason for that. It's because this is new science. Between 1996 and 2001, in the whole of academia, there were 23 papers about the impact of behaviour on performance. Between 2011 and 2016, there were 1,700. And they pretty much all say the same thing, that this stuff counts. I should check. Have you guys ever seen rudeness at work? Maybe to you, maybe to somebody near you, or maybe it's been by you, and it's absolutely been by me far too many times. When it was to you, just take a second. How did it feel? Because my guess is that if you're remembering somebody being rude to you, you remember being angry. That's interesting because that's not where we start. In the moment when somebody is rude to us, we don't feel angry, particularly if it's coming down a hierarchy. In the moment, we feel belittled, we feel ashamed, and we feel humiliated. And when we feel like that, we feel powerless and childlike. And then slowly, sometimes over minutes, sometimes hours, days, weeks, years, and it can be years, we make sense of it. And we get to that place where we go, how dare you? How dare you come into a room and treat me like that when all I was doing was my absolute best at that moment in time with the information I had in front of me? How dare you? And if you look at the evidence on this, and this is from people like Christine Porath, how do people respond to rudeness? Just a sort of side question. Are there any TNO consultants in the room? Any TNO doctors in the room? Excellent. So this is not, that makes you number 4, right? So I've given variations on this talk to, must be about 12,000 people. You're the 4th person to have been in orthopedics at that moment in time. And I'm pretty sure 2 of the other ones were asleep and just heard orthopedics and put their hand up. And this is not to slag off orthopods, because I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't come here and slag off another specialty or anybody else, really. because the orthopods where I work, I am massively impressed by. When I did orthopedics way back in the day, it's a long, long time ago, we used to just discuss bones. The orthopods where I work, I sometimes get my regis to watch them on the ward round, because all winter long, maybe not this year, but normally all winter long, the orthopedic ward round is in the emergency department. And you would see them, they'd come with their new registrars, and they'd stand outside the door and they'd say, tell me about this patient. And they'd say, it's a distal third tibia, it's 30 degrees angulated, it's closed, there's no neurovascular compound. And they go, stop. Please tell me about this patient. What's their name? Where do they live? What happened? Do they have stairs? All this other stuff. And this is not the orthopedics that I existed in when I was training. This is a different sort of orthopedics, and I completely respect it. The way that moved on to this holistic approach to looking at patients and trying to do the right thing for folks. So I'm not here to slag off orthopedics, much as it would be kind of fun. No, it's just in case anybody doesn't understand the next slide, and you can explain it to them afterwards, if that's all right. So 98% of us want to get even. And we will wait years to get even with people. And they often don't have a clue that they offended us in the first place. That's a whole other conversation. We might get onto that afterwards. So I want to talk for a few minutes about a bit more of the evidence around the impact of rudeness on our performance. And to do it, I'm going to talk about bandwidth. Bandwidth is effectively your working memory. It's the bit of your memory that's right in front of you. You can pluck up bits and come up with creative solutions, because healthcare is massively creative. There are people who think that we work off flow diagrams all the time. No flow diagram lasts for more than about 30 seconds. We are all constantly working our way around difficult stuff. It's a complex adaptive system, and we need to be creative within that and try to get to the right thing for our patients. So we need to be creative. We require working memory to do that. On a good day with a following wind, you can hold 5 to 7 things in your working memory, and that's brilliant. You can come up with some brilliant creative stuff. Unfortunately, we've got lives. We've got cars, houses, bills, family, and that stuff takes up some of our working memory. And anybody who says, hey, you leave that at the front door when you come into work, anybody who says that has never come to work with a really sick kid at home, or a relationship that's falling apart, because you can't leave it at the front door. Most of us cannot leave that at the front door, and it takes up a bit of our bandwidth. So we end up in this position where we are dealing with 3 or 4 things in our working short-term memory. And that's great, because that's actually enough for us to be able to come up with good creative solutions. There are 4 different groups that we could talk about just now, but we're only going to talk about 2 of them. We're going to talk about the impact on the recipient of rudeness and the impact on bystanders. So for recipient, if somebody is rude to us, and by rude I'm not talking about screaming and shouting. If you really scream and shout to somebody, if you're really hostile to them, that's way beyond rude. That can cause people to close down. You can overload their amygdala, and you can drive them into what's called a freeze state. And when we started talking about this, one of the examples that Joe, who runs Civility Saves Lives with me, one of the examples Joe was giving me was of being in theatre, and a consultant and a registrar, and the consultant lost it at the registrar, absolutely lost it, shouting, shouting, shouting across the patient. And the registrar said, but, and then stopped, just stood there. And this tirade came in their direction. And then it finished. The registrar had to leave, and the operation continued. The registrar, whilst that tirade was going on, was unable to leave, not because they didn't have permission, but they physically weren't able to move. This freeze state, when you're so scared you can't move, is a real thing, and people can be driven into that, and some of us will have seen that happen at work. If you've never seen it, never experienced it in real life, you will have experienced it in a dream. In a dream, when you're so scared you can't move, that's a thing that happens to human beings in real life when they are completely overwhelmed by behaviour towards them. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about mild to moderate rudeness. You come and chat afterwards and say, Chris, thank you very much for coming to Kettering. It's lovely to see you. We were told that we'd get a lot out of it, but listen, thanks for trying to get me out of the afternoon clinic. And it's a wee bit rude, but it's not horrific, and God knows I hear much worse at work on a regular basis. And what's the impact on the recipient? Well, it turns out that mild to moderate rudeness reduces our working memory, that's the creative bit of us that sits in front of us, by on average 61%. And we cart it with us through the day. So imagine at the beginning of the day, you have an interaction with somebody who leaves you feeling a bit rubbish. You then cart that with you through the rest of the day. You may not be thinking about it, but it's processing in the back of your mind. It's taken up a little bit of your working memory. And then you finish work. You get in the car, you get on the bus, you're going home, you stop at the lights and you have that moment when your bandwidth opens up and you go, oh, boom, that's what I should have said. If I said that right there, then she would have known just how smart I am and she wouldn't come and do that with me again. Why didn't I think about it then? But of course, in the moment, you couldn't. In the moment, when somebody is rude to us, they compress our bandwidth, and we are quite literally less. We are not the wonderful, smart, witty people that we are right now in this room. We are diminished when people treat us that way. And to go back to the importance of being the smartest guy in the room, if it's important to me to be the smartest guy in the room, that's what I was taught I should be all the way through my education. If it's important for me to be the smartest guy in the room, I can make myself the smartest guy in the room. I can do it by being the consultant in a room, or the boss, doesn't matter who you are. I can be a bit acerbic, a bit cutting. I can play it as wit. But what I'm doing is I am closing other people down, and they are less intelligent than they would have been. And I do create a situation where I am the smartest guy in the room. That might be good for my ego, but it's not good for patients, and it's not good for good team decisions. And I think we all know people who do this. What I would say very, very explicitly is I do not believe that a single one of them does it deliberately. I think that has been role model to lots of us as what leadership looks like, the opportunity to be that cutting, sarcastic person, and that we just continue doing that. So this is absolutely not to point fingers at anybody. I think just being taken into that place, and some people have taken that up as their style, but it has a very negative impact on the people in. So, slides have merged together. That's all right. Impact on staff onlookers. With your permission, I will tell you another story from my time at UHCW, which is an organisation that I love working for. And because it could easily sound like this is me coming sliding off the place where I work. I really love it. I'm massively proud to work there. I do a 100-mile round trip on a daily basis to go to work and go home. And I am not the person who travels the furthest to come to be part of the consultant team that I work in. So this is not about me slagging off the organisation, but it is about me being an idiot, unfortunately. And this is a story in resource from a while back when my colleague had tried to refer a patient to the neurosurgical registrar, and he'd said no. Now, I know the guy, he's a really good guy. What I didn't know is that he's a really good guy having a really bad day. And I said to my colleague, listen, you go and take that next patient through there, and I'll go and chat to him. I went to him and said, got this woman, 43-year-old lady, really like a neurosurgical consult. And he said, no. So I went to second tactic. Second tactic looks a little bit like this in emergency medicine. Is there anybody from emergency medicine in here? So I'm giving away a trade secret here. Okay, so second tactic looks like this. Look, I'm sorry, I don't think you understood. I've got this patient. I think it's neurosurgical. I'm not so sure. If I'd been smarter, if I'd worked harder at medical school in Edinburgh in the 1980s, if I'd had more natural skill, I would have loved to have been a neurosurgeon. And I'm so glad that you're here. Could you possibly just see this lady? And you would be astonished how often that works. Eh? I mean, it really is. I mean, you just swallow your pride and you get what you want. And he said no. And I was beginning to lose my rag. And I then escalated further. And I decided that the next appropriate thing to do would be in the department to drop the C-bomb. So what I said was, no, I'm really sorry. You don't seem to understand. I am not asking you to see this patient. I am telling you to see this patient. And I am telling you because I am the consultant. And he looked at me and he did this. He went, what do I care? I'm going to be a consultant someday anyway. What does that even mean? But by this point, we were making no sense whatsoever. And as I stood there, I had nothing except for this. I can tell you that the red mist can descend from the Pentland Hills just outside Edinburgh into UHCW emergency department in under about half a second. And as I stood there and my voice got deeper, louder and more Scottish, and I drew myself up to the full 5'7" and a half, I saw two things happening. The first is that my wonderful, fantastic, amazing colleague, the nurse in charge, did precisely what her title suggests, and she charged around her desk and she grabbed the pair of us and she took us round the corner in a move that is known as taking somebody up the back corridor, where I come from, and she took us round there because whatever this crap was, she did not want it happening in her department, and I thank her for that. And the second thing is that people's heads started to go down. First one, pop, then another one, pop, then pop, 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 as this shout, as this rage started, as we escalated, next one, escalated, pop, 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 all these heads going down all around. And I realise when I talk about it, I have seen this happen before, to my shame. My head has gone down at times, but I have also caused people's heads to go down. Everybody's head's going down, all apart from one guy, 3.5 meters in that direction. And in my corrupted memory, this guy is definitely watching us. He's watching us. He's opening a packet of crisps and he's getting a can of Coke out his bag, because this is the best thing that's going to happen his entire day, is watching this fight unfold. And I used to try and tell myself that those people whose heads were going down, they were just going back to work. The evidence on it is that that's not what's happening. They're trying to go back to work, but the first thing they're doing is avoiding the eye of Sauron, because they know that the way that I treated the last person is the way I am likely to treat the next person I talk to, and we all learn that as kids. And the second thing is they are trying to go back to work. Their heads are going down, they are trying to think about their work, but you can measure the decrease in performance. And on average, they have a 20% decrease in their performance. But that's not all. I mean, it's worth thinking there's often a lot of people around, that's a lot of 20%. But there is more. If they get up and walk around the corner, having been primed by being near to somebody who is being hostile, not directly to them, just near it, and somebody asks them for help, they are 50% less likely to help those people. If you prime people with rudeness, and you then get them to look at a page of drug calculations to check for errors, they miss 50% more errors. And it's what happens when our working memory gets taken up by this emotional stuff that squeezes it all. There's one group of people who are more likely to be rude than any others. People in authority. And there's a body of work by people like Dacher Keltner and Paul Pith that looks at this. And something changes in us when we become bosses, for lots of us. And it certainly happened to me. And we know that if somebody is a boss, they are 3 times more likely to sit in a meeting on a computer for something other than that meeting. They are 3 times more likely to interrupt people, and they're 3 times more likely to raise their voice. When we become bosses, we frequently treat the authority as the right to behave as we like, rather than the responsibility to get the most out of the people around us. And this drifts very quickly into well-being and helping people to feel their best at work, because it turns out that the single most important person determining your well-being at work is your line manager, your direct line manager. And that can change at various times, but people don't leave jobs, they leave bosses a lot of the time. And many of the people in this room will have left the job because of a boss, if not most of us. Okay, let's pull it together. This is 1959. It's Western General Hospital in Edinburgh. The NHS is 11 years old. And that's my mum. On my mum's right is Julie. On my mum's left is Charlotte. Julie, my mum and Charlotte have been pals now forever. Julie died a couple of weeks ago. Those 3 were still going out and having coffee together, and Charlotte was across from Canada. And they're properly feisty, absolutely awesome, forged in the NHS, still talking their stories about when they were girls back in the early 60s. And back in 1959, twice a day, one of my mum's jobs was to clean the ashtrays, one of which was embedded, not sitting on top, but embedded in every single bedside cabinet. The doctors encouraged patients to smoke, and I like to think that my mum would walk around and say, "Do you smoke?" And they'd say, "No, do you want to try one?" She hates it when I say that. And then what happened? Well, Professor Dahl came along, and we learned of the terrible toll that tobacco takes on health. And people who work within health stopped the advice that they were giving, and we changed what we did. People outside health changed what we did, and very gradually, over a long period of time, smoking became less and less acceptable. So now it's 2020. We're beginning to understand the impact that behaviour has on individual and team performance. That's great. What a wonderful opportunity. Because by choosing to behave in ways which value and respect the individuals around us, we help them as individuals to perform at their peak. When we help individuals to perform at their peak, we can help teams to perform at their peak. And teams which perform at their peak have better outcomes, both for patients and for staff. Or, in other words, civility saves lives. Thank you so much for listening. Do you want to do questions? How do you want to do it?
Yeah, if anyone has questions from the floor, possible.
Please.
My name is Innocent. I'm not a doctor. I just wanted to hear because I'm a home doctor. But my question is there anything called perceived instability?
Perceived instability.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or perceived rudeness.
Yeah. So the question is there anything called perceived rudeness? Absolutely. This is all about perception. This is the really uncomfortable thing about this. That there's a mismatch between what people intend and what people perceive, and it is consistent. The mechanism through which it happens, if you're happy for me to talk psychology for a moment or two, is there's something called fundamental attribution error. When we see somebody doing something that we feel bad about, we look at them doing that act and we say they are therefore a bad person and they made us feel bad. When we are the person doing the same act, we have something called the illusion of transparency. And the illusion of transparency says that if I do this act, which I know looks a bit bad to some people, you will understand that this is the best thing I can do in this situation with the data I have in front of me, and those two completely miss each other. When we assume that people tried to hurt us, and that's what we do because we're human beings. We're programmed to assume that whatever just happened was about us and somebody was trying to hurt us. We probably miss the point most of the time, because very few people deliberately try to hurt others. We feel like they're deliberately trying to hurt us, but they're not. What they're displaying is their own personal distress in a moment, in a situation, sometimes without control. And if they're doing it down a hierarchy, that feels profoundly awful to the person on the receiving end of it. So that if we want to get out of the cycle, kind of need to step back a little bit and we try to understand the impact of the behaviour on somebody else. But oftentimes, if I'm rude to somebody at work, or if I cause somebody distress at work, I can pretty much guarantee you, innocent, that I was not trying to cause them distress. But they feel it, and what they feel has a direct impact on their ability to perform. And if nobody tells me, if I don't find out that I've offended somebody, then I can't do anything about it. So we need systems that allow us to tell somebody that they've inadvertently caused offence, and it is almost always inadvertent. So we perceive rudeness, it has exactly the same impact on us as somebody being deliberately rude to us. It doesn't matter if it's deliberate or not deliberate, it has the same impact on us, but we don't have the systems that allow us to then let somebody know. They are out there. We might get onto that in a minute.
Thank you.
So.
Thanks for a fantastic talk. That's really amazing. So, where have you seen organisations tackle this? And if you were giving a board advice on how to start leading a conversation about how to do something different, what would your messages be? And it would be good to hear about. I appreciated your personal reflections, but it would be good to hear about some organisations that have tackled this and gone into a positive space.
So. The biggest body of evidence around this comes from America, from work by a guy called Jerry Hickson. Jerry Hickson works out of Nashville. He's a paediatrician. I happened to go on holiday to Nashville with the family just a couple of years ago and got to go and see Jerry Hickson. That was nice. And what he did was this. Jerry Hickson, about 20 years ago, said, what would happen if we told people when they'd caused offence? And people said, why bother? This was about doctors, specifically about doctors. There's no point telling doctors if they've caused offence because they don't care. They're allowed to behave like that. They don't care if they've caused offence. He said, well, maybe we could just tell them. And what he did was he created a system that meant that there was a second messenger coming. So, suppose I'm having a conversation with Keith and I offend Keith. Keith is now hurt, his performance is impaired, but I don't know that because I didn't intend to. A lot of the time people say Keith should then be able to come and tell me that I've hurt him. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work like that because we cannot go and tell people that have offended us that they offended us, because oftentimes they respond, well, I didn't mean that at all. And also, when you're having that conversation, pushing that conversation up a hierarchy, that's overwhelming. So you need a second messenger system. You need a system whereby trained people come and have a conversation with me to say, Chris, there's been a thing. And the version of this that we came up with, so I've done a lot of work on this. We did it with the Royal College of Surgeons of Ireland with Hadas Levy, who's one of the psychologists there. And we came up with something called calling it out with compassion. And at its core, there's a second messenger system. This is really similar to Hickson's work, possibly slightly softer. And the conversation has three components. Somebody would come and talk to me and say, Chris, how are you? No, really, how are you? And they check in with me, make sure I'm all right, because people who hurt other people are often hurting themselves. They have big issues and they don't have the bandwidth to be that nice, wonderful person that they could be. And sometimes we stop the conversation then. So we run this in lots of departments across the country. Sometimes we stop the conversation there because the person you're talking to is in such distress. And by asking them, how are you? No, really, how are you? You discover that their marriage is falling apart, they've got a sick child at home, something terrible is happening to them. And at that point, we signpost them towards help. But if they're okay, the next bit is, what happened today in theatre, in the office, on the shop floor? And they might surface it. And people, when they surface something at that point, say, well, I made this joke. It was a terrible joke. I realised it could have sounded racist. But it's okay because nobody heard it. Actually, people heard it. What happens at that point is people go into what's called service restoration mode. They go, oh no, I've offended people. And they leave and they go to want to talk to them to make it better. Because we don't like leaving a trail of devastation in our wake. Even the people we think like leaving that trail of devastation in our wake don't like doing that. The third bit is that if they haven't surfaced it at that point, it goes, so Chris, it's just to let you know that after you had that conversation with Keith, people noted that he looked really distressed, and I know that you'd want to know. So that's it. There's no, and what are you going to do about it? Because at that moment, when I get told that I have caused Keith distress, I am feeling personal distress because I did not intend to hurt Keith. And when we go down the slippery slope of believing it was intentional on my part, we fail to help me to solve the problem. And then people choose how they want to behave going forward. Now, the Higson work has numbers associated with it because they keep their numbers in a way that we're not really in a position to do within the NHS around this. So over the last 5 to 10 years, in 150 to 200 hospitals, they've had more than 37,000 cup of coffee conversations. It's a peer-to-peer second messenger system. After one cup of coffee conversation, these hospitals are committed to calling this stuff out. Only 2,000 people repeat offended. So by being told the impact that we're having on people around them, people going, that's terrible, I don't want to be like that. Only 2,000 repeat offended. They have a second cup of coffee conversation, sometimes with more data, just about how people are finding them to work with. Again, it is gentle, compassionate, it is respectful. And after that, they're down to 267. So 267 is an interesting number. 267 individuals between 150 to 200 hospitals over 5 to 10 years is, over that period of time, less than 2 doctors going through a conduct disciplinary system per hospital. And that's fairly profound. Now, I don't believe this is all about doctors, it's just that's where the evidence base comes from. And if we can be in organisations where when we hear that something bad has happened, where we have a system that allows us to have a conversation with the person, the supposed perpetrator, and we can let them know the impact of that, then we get into a position where we allow people to know that, and then they can make a conscious, professional choice about how they are the next time. Otherwise, we just leave them behaving that way and assume that they are just bad eggs. And it's not fair, and it's professionally unfair as well. So there you go. That may have been slightly more than you anticipated as an answer. Apologies. Rabia.
Is there anything like fluctuating civility? And I'll tell you why I'm asking that. Is a couple of months ago or 3 months ago, you look around, not just in Kettering, but anywhere in the world, and you keep hearing that actually what got the whole world through the COVID surge or the peak was the compassion. And more recently, you keep hearing same people, not massive exodus or change of teams, but the attitudes and behaviors are different, and there is that frictions coming in. And so you hear it, when you talk to your neighbors and you talk to your friends, or when you talk to your team as well. So the same people, but different behaviors. So I'm just thinking that fluctuation.
Absolutely. The ability to be our best selves with each other is determined by all sorts of stuff. I mean, tiredness is a really good example of this, but having the shared goals. Going into COVID, it was unprecedented. We, as healthcare professionals, had a single overarching goal. We didn't have lots and lots and lots of different services all trying to do different things and rubbing up each other their own way. We said, this is what we need to do to save lives. And we goal aligned, we focused, and we went in that direction. And people just put their backs into it. Coming out of that at the other end, we have the same good people knackered, who've been working really hard for a long period of time, who perhaps don't have the bandwidth to be the best versions of themselves, who've maybe lost a little bit of that emotional intelligence. And we end up rubbing people up the wrong way, and particularly as we come out of it and we are going into a whole bunch of different things going on, haven't we? We've got the people who are still dealing with COVID. Then we have the restoration of service guys who are talking about how we're going to restore service, and these guys who are still dealing with COVID are going, are you kidding me? We've got people who are completely knackered, who've been working in intensive cares, who are now being asked to go back to other jobs, and that's distressing for them. You have to make sense of this stuff. If you want to help people to not get burnt out by this, one of the things that you meant to do is you meant to allow them to spend time together to sense make. And a lot of organisations aren't able to do that because of the competing pressures. And so we are tired. We are tired coming out of it. We're not the best versions of ourselves. So that's all negative. The positive bit to this is there is a way to help to try to avoid it. And it sounds simple, it is really not easy to do. It is about taking the time with each other to be kind. Not just being all about business, stopping, checking in, making sure folk are okay, and understanding where they're coming from at this moment in time, instead of thinking everyone's just being awkward, because they're not. They're just tired, and we can't expect ourselves to be. It's like staying up all night and getting a good night's sleep. We're just different people if we do those two different things. So yes, our ability to be civil with each other fluctuates, but we can offset that somewhat by taking the time to be kind.
Chris, I think it was Lucien Lee who said it, you know, that the doctor is the ultimate sort of non-discriminating individual around, around rudeness. And you sort of highlighted the fact that there's a degree of truth around this. What I have noticed there, I'm interested in your views on this, is that this excoriating rudeness that you spoke about being exported in the 1980s, sort of all around the country. I mean, that was well rooted within the health system then. But what I am seeing is I'm seeing a different generation of doctors coming through who have different values to the values we were sort of gestated in. And so I've got a lot of hope for the way things are going.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I think one of the big problems is for people of our generation. We had a version of leadership role model to us, which probably was fairly damaging to a lot of people. I think a lot of damaged individuals passed on a damaging version of leadership and so on and so forth. I think there are a couple of things. So there's Gaith's generation coming through who see the world in a different way. The millennials definitely see things in a different way. But there's also an evidence base, because I think if you want doctors to change their behaviour, being nice for the sake of being nice. Apologies, I'm going to talk about doctors for a second because that's what I know. If you tell doctors to change their behaviour, being nice for the sake of being nice doesn't matter to most doctors unless being nice helps us to perform at a higher level. Being respectful, nice, respectful. Unless that helps to perform at a higher level, then we're not really going to buy into that. And I think that the evidence base is the thing that helps us to stop, pause and go, yeah, this stuff really is important. It's almost important enough to unlearn our previous behaviours and to think about learning new behaviours. And in fact, for many people, it is absolutely important enough for that. So yeah, I have tremendous hope and faith that things are changing.
Have you got any questions on?
Yes.
Do you want to shout out? Is there any question?
Dr. Verma, a consulting gastroenterologist here, asked a question. He says, very apt talk at the moment. I've been working with chiefs and medical director teams to come up with a mission/watershed policy to reduce conflict, as it is very debilitating every time there is a clash. Have you implemented similar things at your hospital?
implemented similar things makes it sound like there's I don't know, some kind of campaign. So what I would say about that, firstly, no, not formal. Secondarily, conflict. I am a conflict avoidant individual. You wouldn't think that to hear my story about the neurosurgeon, to be fair, but I really don't like conflict. And what I've had to learn is that there are two distinct forms of conflict, probably more than this, but there's destructive conflict and there's creative conflict. And destructive conflict is a conflict where winning is the most important thing. All I care about is winning this argument, and say a patient's involved, it doesn't matter, push the patient out of the way and this is going to mean me and you are going head to head. And then there's creative conflict. And in complex situations, there should always be conflict. There should be disagreement, not conflict. Because if everybody agrees what the answer is in a complex situation, you've not got the right people in the room. You need to be hearing different perspectives on this. And part of this is about how we have respectful conflict, respectful discourse, disagreement. And it's not about dominating conversations to win. It's about being part of a conversation to get to the best answer. And if people are interested, there's a thing called the Thomas Kuhlman conflict inventory that you can do, which tells you about your own style of conflict. What sort of person are you when you get in a fight with folk? And is it about winning or is it about something different for you? So I think the conflict is inevitable. It is how we choose to hold that discourse that matters for individuals and organisations. And also understand that people do get hit up sometimes, but that isn't actually helpful. And it can't just be about winning. It has to be about understanding better. Ravi.
You find more questions?
Interesting question here. Regarding free-state shutdown, interesting, as many of our autistic community and mental health patients often complain, we do not consider their needs and respect reasonable adjustments. So I suspect this has an even bigger impact on people with neuroindifference. So I guess the question here is, regarding incivility, what's the effect on that population of people with neuroindifference?
Okay, and the answer is, I don't really know. But that respectful conversations with everybody, that gives people the chance to talk, that gives them the chance to feel heard, and to make, when we go back and we make sure that people feel that they have A, been heard and B, been answered, is hopefully one way of helping people to get over that, get over the sensation that people are not taking them seriously, not listening to them. It's a complicated space, and it's not one that I have done much reading around. So that's my best guess from what I know. Okay.
My question was, so you mentioned about onlookers and the impact on onlookers as well. So I've been rude to somebody in a team or in a meeting, and I reflected on it and felt bad, and that wasn't the best version of me. So I want to go back and acknowledge it and say sorry. But the first encounter was in front of everybody. Should it be when you're apologizing or having that talk, be in your office over a cup of tea in one-to-one, or should it be actually, because the impact on onlookers, be in front of everybody?
So that depends on what you are able to do as an individual, Ravi. There is evidence that saying sorry is profoundly positive to your reputation. Now, I wouldn't suggest being rude so as you can say sorry, all right? But if people who can go back and say, I am sorry, are then seen in a more positive light than they were before the incident happened. Going and saying sorry, it has to mean something. It has to mean something to the person you're talking to. But also, it probably is worthwhile going back and talking to people who were around. And so I'll give you an example from my world, because I have to practice what I preach around this stuff. Patient comes into resus, I decide that I want to cardiovert them. So I want to sedate them, put electricity through their chest to change the heart rhythm. And I've gone back to the middle of the department. Somebody comes along and says, oh, we've given them this, this, and this drug. I'd already had the conversation. I was like, oh, for God's sake, why have you done it? So I walk through and I stand at the end of the bed and I say, why did you do this? You knew I wanted to do this. You knew I wanted to cardiovert this patient. I'm saying this in front of the bloody patient. This is a disaster, okay? And I stand there and I walk back and I walk back into the middle of the department and I go, what have I done? I then, because the thing that they'd chosen to do was fine. It was absolutely fine. You know, they were in equipoise. You could have cardioverted them, could have given them the drugs. I just made my mind up and then was hacked off that other people had done something different. And I had to go back and I had to apologise to the cardiac nurse practitioners. I had to apologise to the medical students who were around. I had to apologise to the nurses who were in the room. And finally, I had to sit with the patient and explain to the patient, I'm sorry that I've spoken like that. Actually, their treatment was absolutely fine. It was just not where my head was at. So I did go and do all those, and it took bloody ages. It was a pain, a complete pain to do it. But I think it was probably the right thing to do. There is a bit of story that I didn't tell you in there that if you don't mind, I think I've got long enough just to finish off story. I just want to finish off the story about the neurosurgeon, because I currently forget to tell people about this. I start off by saying he's a good guy having a bad day. I didn't tell you about what his bad day was. And this was his bad day. He had been called down to the emergency department, possibly fast bleeped to the emergency department to come and see this woman because somebody said she's going to breach. He's down in the emergency department seeing this patient and he's going, no, 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 because he's looking at the patient, he's going, there's no way. She is the person who needs my help the most. When we got round the corner, there was a tea machine there. I made a cup of tea. As I was making the cup of tea, I was trying to calm myself down. I made him a cup of tea and I gave him a cup of tea. Now, he really reluctantly accepted this cup of tea because at this point, we really just wanted to knife each other. And then we calmed down enough. And I asked him, what's going on? And he told me this. He'd been in theatre all day. He had 3 patients who had neurosurgical operations that he wanted to get to the ward to check on to make sure they were okay after they had had these life-changing surgeries. And instead of being able to go to check on the 3 patients he'd been wanting to see, he'd been dragged down to the emergency department to see somebody who literally could have waited a few more hours. And he was feeling the pressure and tension of those patients up on the ward. Now, once I knew that, we could have a conversation. The conversation went, you go and see your patients on the ward. Sort out somebody to come and see this patient at some point, but please go and see your patients on the ward. I have no idea if he walked around the corner and went, yes, showed them. I don't really care, because the truth is that the patients who really needed his care at that moment in time were the patients up on the ward. They weren't the patients in the patient in the emergency department. She could reasonably wait. And I could have avoided that whole complete mess if instead of trying to be the big man and dominate my colleague, I had just shut up and then said, are you okay? This isn't like you. What's happening? If I'd done that, none of that would have happened. I wouldn't have had that great anecdote. I wouldn't be able to make you all laugh, but it would have been better for patients. And if I hadn't fronted up in that way, and I had been a slightly better version of myself, I think we would have had a better outcome.
Any more questions? Yeah, Harsha?
There's been a change in people's behaviors over the last 30 years with rudeness becoming less and people actively making an effort to be civil in all situations. And quite often, as you mentioned in this anecdote just now, there is a background reason why they are letting off steam. Is there any understanding what happens to people if they keep it all bottled in constantly? Is there blowouts? Is there burnouts or other mental issues, or do they go home and whatever? What is the other side of it?
So on the individual basis, when they're keeping it bottled up, we probably do need to reflect, we probably do need to talk with colleagues and make sense of things. What we know though is that individuals who are permitted to blow up, and they tend to be people who are more senior, because the higher up you get, the more you're allowed to behave that way, cause huge amounts of damage to the people around them. And to my mind, there is the professional responsibility to get the best out of the people around you, and that means not blowing up at them. How we deal with our professional frustrations is probably something that's best dealt with amongst our professional group, and having those reasonable, if you're a consultant level discussions, if you're band 7 level discussions, so that people understand the frustration of their world, and sometimes having the conversation with the people that you feel are causing the frustration, but respectfully, to understand, not to win. That's the best I can do for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Oops, wrap it up. You're right.
I'm okay. Yeah. Transatlantic fall. So thank you very much. I was just going to ask Simon to say a few words to bring it to close. It was really fascinating. Awesome. I loved it, and I'm sure everyone else enjoyed as well.
So thanks first to Geet and to Rabia for organising this. This came out of not my inspiration. It's people who are sitting here who have had these ideas and who wanted to try and encourage different types of conversation. Was that the best of me, I think, is the way that we put it around here. And I think it's a conversation that we need to continue to have in the health service, because we all know that this is not the end of COVID. This is just a pause between things, and the pressure is going to come on. And so I think these conversations are needed more than ever now in hospitals right up and down the country. I also believe that it's a profound responsibility of boards and leadership in the organisation to take those conversations forward. So my commitment is that we will go back to our board and we will continue this conversation, and we will think about how do we encourage and permit that type of conversation. I was really fascinated by that second messenger system, and something that I will definitely take away and think about, because that's the sort of thing that actually makes a compassionate difference, doesn't it? It's not about being punitive, it's about giving people the opportunity to be different. So Chris, thank you so much. A fantastic, inspirational talk. I know I've taken a lot from it myself, and I'm sure everybody who was watching and listening, as well as those of us in the room, did so too. So can we say thank you to Chris one more time?